Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the exhausting, invisible, and tragically underappreciated life of a medieval woman. You've seen queens in crowns and ladies twirling in fields, but the truth? Most women in the Middle Ages didn't have time to frolic. They were too busy surviving. Her daily to-do list wasn't optional. It was written in blood, sweat, and a whole lot of silence. Give birth, don't die, keep going, no rights, no rest, and definitely no romance subplot. If you're expecting a love story, this might not be your night. But if you're curious about what it really meant to be female in a time of cold stone floors, arranged marriages, and prayer-based healthcare, you're in the right place. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy history that's a little dark and a little sleepy. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little night history club grow. Now, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in something warm, and let's settle in for a long, quiet walk through her impossible life. You don't wake up when you're ready. You wake up when the animals do. Before the sun, before the birds, before your bones even remember how to move. There's no alarm clock, just a rooster with boundary issues and your mother-in-law slamming a bucket near your head like she's swatting the devil. You don't stretch. You don't yawn. You sit up and brace for pain, because everything hurts, always. Your hair is a mess, but not in the cute, medieval maiden, waiting for love kind of way. It's tangled, crusted with sweat, and probably full of hay. You slept on a straw mattress, shared with 2 children, a coughing baby, and a husband who snores like a dying ox. Privacy isn't a thing. Space isn't a thing. Your body? Also not yours. You reach for your headscarf, not because it's fashionable, but because showing your hair is indecent, scandalous even. You wrap it with practiced fingers, the same way your mother did, and her mother before her. It's not about looking good. It's about not looking shameful. Breakfast? Maybe. A piece of stale bread, if the rats didn't get to it first. If you're lucky, a spoonful of cold porridge. You don't eat to enjoy. You eat to function. And even that's optimistic. Your first task of the day isn't something poetic like greet the morning. It's clean the chamber pot. Yes, that one. The one that smells like despair. Then it's feeding animals, hauling water, and trying not to step on a chicken. The well is half a field away. Your back already aches. You're 19, by the way. There's no me time, no journaling, no yoga, just relentless, unchanging obligation. If you pause, it's not for reflection. It's because you forgot what comes next. And someone's already yelling at you from the next room. If your children are awake, you dress them. If they're crying, you shush them. If they're sick, you pray, because that's all you can do. Doctors are for nobility. You get herbs and hope. And no, your husband doesn't help. He has to work, which somehow doesn't include changing diapers or scrubbing soot from the hearth. You might think he's off to slay dragons. He's really just arguing with the neighbor about pig prices. You don't dream. Not really. Dreams require rest. And rest is a luxury you can't afford. What you have is routine. Sacred. Exhausting. Impossible routine. And yet, you keep going. Because if you don't, the house falls apart. The food spoils. The children suffer. And someone will say you're lazy, or sinful, or cursed. Possibly all 3. So you keep moving, keep sweeping, keep breathing. Not for glory, not for love, just because it's morning. And that means it's time to serve. You don't fall in love. You get assigned. Somewhere between your first period and your last game of pretend, someone, usually male, always older, decides it's time you became useful. At 13 or 14, maybe younger if the harvest's been good, your name becomes part of a marriage contract negotiated over ale and property lines. You are not the prize. You are the clause. You're introduced to your future husband once, maybe twice. He doesn't ask what you like. He doesn't care. He's older. He owns land. And more importantly, he needs an heir. You have hips and a working womb. That's enough. There's no wedding dress. No romantic proposal. Just a hand-me-down veil and a muttered prayer that this doesn't hurt too much. You don't walk down an aisle. You're walked over like a bridge between 2 families trying to keep peace, land, or cattle, sometimes all 3. The marriage bed is not a place of intimacy. It's a place of obligation, of expectation. You're told to lie still, be silent, and pray. No one explains what will happen. No one asks if you're ready. Ready doesn't matter. Your doll is still in the corner. You haven't touched it since your engagement was announced. It's covered in dust, like your childhood. Once married, you become wife, a title that sounds dignified until you realize it comes with no salary, no weekends, and no exit plan. You now belong to your husband, legally, spiritually, socially. Your name may remain, but your identity, gone. You move into his family's home, which isn't just his. It's filled with his mother, his sisters, his aunts, all of whom view you as competition or disappointment. You're expected to know everything instantly. How to churn, how to sew, how to kneel properly in church. Mistakes aren't corrected, they're punished, or worse, whispered about. You're expected to bear children, quickly. If you don't, it's your fault. If the child dies, it's your curse. If you die in childbirth, that's nature. No one weeps too long. Life moves on. The field still needs tilling. And through it all, you smile. Or try to, because anything less is seen as ungrateful. After all, you're lucky to be married, lucky to have been chosen, lucky that someone wanted a girl with no dowry, no voice, and no vote. You watch as boys your age continue to run, to dream, to choose. You watch as girls around you get handed off like livestock, one by one. And you understand, quietly, that freedom is not a thing you will ever know. You don't get romance, you get duty. You don't get options, you get told. You don't get time to grow up, because girlhood ends the moment someone else decides it does. Your body is no longer your own. It's a vessel now, a factory, a prayer wrapped in flesh. The village expects children. Your husband expects sons. The church expects obedience. No one asks what you expect. You get pregnant. There's no doctor, no midwife, unless the neighbor woman counts. No vitamins, just hope. Hope that the child forms correctly, that it doesn't come too early or too late, that it doesn't kill you on the way out. You carry low, your back aches, your ankles swell, and people say it's a good sign. You throw up daily, faint from hunger, and still churn butter with a smile, because complaining is weakness, and weakness is sin. Labor begins without warning, in a barn, on the floor, in the dark. There's no epidural, no sterile gloves, no warm light and reassuring voice. Just screaming, blood, and a woman older than dirt telling you to breathe. Breathe like your life depends on it, because it does. You scream into a rag so you don't scare the other children. You crush your own fingers against splintered wood. You beg, but you whisper, because too much noise might make the neighbors talk. Might make your mother-in-law shake her head. The baby comes. If it cries, everyone exhales. If it doesn't, no one does. You bleed. A lot. They say it's normal. You shake. They wrap you in a blanket that smells like mold and old potatoes and tell you to rest. But there's no resting. Not really. Because in a few hours, the baby will cry. And it will be your job to feed it, clean it, rock it. And if it dies in the night, because babies do, you'll still be expected to be grateful you're alive. You might bury one, or two, or six. No markers, just little mounds behind the shed. People will say God needed another angel. You will say nothing, because mourning too loudly is unseemly. Then you'll get pregnant again, and again, and again. Because birth control doesn't exist. Because refusing your husband isn't an option. Because every month without a pregnancy makes the house quieter, tenser. Because if you don't produce heirs, someone else will. And that someone might move into your room. You age faster than the seasons. Your teeth loosen. Your hands shake. You're 30 but you look 50. And still another child. Because more children mean more labourers. More chances to survive the winter. More names to carry the bloodline. More mouths to feed with food that barely exists. And when you die, which you probably will, it'll be called noble, holy, even, dying in childbirth. That's a good death. No one will write your name down. But someone will say, she gave many children. And to them, that will mean everything. To you, it meant your life. You hurt. Of course you do. You've been bleeding for weeks, your stomach still hasn't shrunk, and your legs feel like old tree roots, but you're alive. And that means no one wants to hear it. You can't cry. That's weakness. You can't complain. That's ingratitude. You can't rest. That's laziness. So you nod, smile, and whisper, "I'm fine," through cracked lips and clenched teeth. Pain is expected. Suffering is routine. Survival? That's your reward. Not comfort. Not care. Just the simple, miraculous fact that you didn't die this time. But don't get too proud. Pride is unholy. The priest says suffering brings you closer to God. Your mother-in-law says her births were harder. Your husband says nothing at all. He doesn't ask. He doesn't look. He assumes you're back to normal because you stood up yesterday and stirred a pot without collapsing. The baby screams through the night, but you're expected to sleep when it sleeps, except it never does. And when you're caught with purple eyes and a shaking hand, someone suggests more prayer. You pray, not for strength. You already have too much of that. You pray for numbness. You're not allowed to scream, even when your stitches tear, even when fever claws your skin, even when your body feels like it's rotting from the inside. Screaming would scare the children and make your husband look weak and offend the saints. So you whisper hymns while holding your stomach together and scrubbing laundry until your knuckles bleed. And if you collapse, it better be quiet, because drama is frowned upon. Women who make a scene are suspicious, hysterical, untrustworthy, possibly possessed. So you master the art of the silent wince, the discreet limp, the half smile that says, "Yes, I just passed a blood clot the size of a plum, but don't worry, I'm making soup." Your health is your responsibility, your pain is your shame, and your suffering is invisible unless it's convenient for someone else's narrative. If you die, they'll say it was her time. If you live, they'll expect dinner. Either way, the chickens still need feeding. There are no doctors, just herbs, no rest, just duty, no therapy, just confession. And if you dare to say, "This hurts," someone will remind you of Job or Mary, or that one cousin who gave birth in a field and went back to ploughing before lunch. You are not supposed to feel, you are supposed to endure. And when they say you're strong, it's not a compliment, it's a warning. Because strength in a woman means she can keep going. No matter what, purity isn't just a virtue, it's your value, your dowry, your only real protection in a world that doesn't believe in protecting you. From the moment you can walk, you're told to keep your legs closed, your voice soft, and your eyes down. You're warned about men, about temptation, about bringing shame to your family by simply existing the wrong way. You're not taught how to defend yourself. You're taught how not to attract attention, walk quickly, speak politely, pray harder. But here's the thing, none of that matters. Because if someone wants to take something from you, they will. And if they do, it will still be your fault. If you cry out, you're dramatic. If you fight back, you're hysterical. If you survive, you're damaged. And if you speak up, you're dangerous. You wear layers of clothing, not to stay warm, but to stay respectable. You cover your hair, your neck, your wrists, because skin equals sin. And if something happens, they'll ask what you were wearing, where you were walking, why you were alone, not why he did it. You're told to stay pure, but no one tells the men anything. They can drink, gamble, cheat, and stumble home at midnight, still respected, still believed, still in church on Sunday. But you? One rumor, one whisper, one wrong glance, and you're finished. Virginity isn't personal. It's public property. Once lost, whether by choice or force, you're no longer good. You're less. And society makes sure you never forget it. Some girls are sent away, others are married off in a hurry, some disappear entirely, and everyone else pretends not to notice. Worse still, if your attacker is wealthy or powerful, the solution isn't justice, it's silence. He confesses, he donates to the church, he's forgiven, you disappear. If you're lucky, you live. If you're not, you become a cautionary tale told in kitchens, your name reduced to a warning. And heaven forbid you get pregnant. There's no paternity test, no sympathy, no safe haven, just whispers and shame, and the slow, crushing collapse of your entire future. Your mother tells you to keep quiet. Your father won't look at you. The priest offers penance. For you, not him. And in all of this, they still expect you to hold your head high, to be graceful, to smile, to carry the weight of someone else's sin like it's your duty. Because that's what a good woman does. She doesn't break. She bows. And even in the darkest moments, she's expected to be modest. Even when violated, she's expected to be pure. Even when shattered, she's expected to be silent. Because in this world, your virtue matters more than your voice. And your silence is mistaken for grace. Your day isn't measured in hours. It's measured in chores. There's no such thing as done, only done enough to avoid being yelled at. The moment you wake, the race begins. And it doesn't end until your body gives up or the sun goes down, whichever comes first. You sweep the dirt floor, which is somehow always dirtier after you sweep it. You feed the chickens, who hate you. You scrub clothes in freezing water with a rock, not because it's efficient, but because that's what your grandmother did. You carry water, buckets, heavy, splashing, across uneven paths that mock your ankles. Laundry? Every piece is scrubbed, rinsed, wrung, and hung. Cooking? Firewood must be chopped first. Fire lit, pots cleaned, soup stirred, bread kneaded, oven managed. Ingredients? Hope you remember to grow them last season. Then there's mending, patching, sewing. Your children wear the same tunic for 3 years because you keep fixing it with prayers and thread pulled from old sheets. You patch socks, shirts, dignity. And when you're not doing all that, you're cleaning things no one will notice unless they're dirty. Windows, dishes, pots, floors, hands, babies. Oh yes, babies. You rock one with your foot while stirring porridge with your right hand and holding back a sneeze with your left. Multitasking is survival. Rest is fiction. And while you're doing all this, you're probably sick. There's a cough you've had for weeks. Your joints feel like rusted door hinges. You think your gums are bleeding, but who has time to check? If you're lucky, there's no plague in town. If you're not, it's already in the house. And no, you don't get to stop. Even as people around you drop, you still boil water, still sweep ash, still bake flatbread because life must go on. Death is just another inconvenience to schedule around. And if you dare to say, "I'm tired," someone will say, "My mother worked through a fever and a funeral." If you cry, someone reminds you that saints suffered more. If you drop a plate, someone mutters, "Ungrateful." You are expected to endure everything, silently, efficiently, with a clean apron. Because in this world, housework isn't just labor. It's virtue, it's worth, it's womanhood. And if you collapse, well, don't bleed on the linens. They were just washed. Speaking is dangerous. Silence, though? Silence must be performed correctly. You're not supposed to talk too much. That's gossip. But you're not supposed to be too quiet either. That's suspicious. You must speak just enough. Measured, polite, pleasing, like seasoning in a soup you weren't allowed to cook. Your voice isn't yours. It's borrowed. From your father, your husband, your priest. You use it to say the right prayers, the right greetings, and the right apologies for things that aren't your fault. You never interrupt, never question, never speak first unless spoken to, unless that's seen as distant or rude, in which case you should have known better. Your tone must be soft, never sharp. Smile when you speak, always, even if your jaw aches, even if your heart is broken, especially then. Disagreeing? That's defiance. Correcting someone? That's arrogance. Having an opinion? That's dangerous, unless it's one that's already approved by someone wearing nicer shoes than you. You must be respectful to everyone above you, which is everyone. The local lord, the priest, your husband, his mother, his sister, the goat that belongs to the tax collector. If it has status, you bow to it. And bowing isn't just about posture, it's about timing, depth, and intention. Too shallow, and you're proud. Too deep, and you're mocking. Do it wrong, and someone might think you're cursed. Or worse, French. Even inside your own home, your words are weighed. You call your husband, "Sir." You call your children blessings. You call your bruises accidents. If you cry, do it quietly. If you laugh, cover your mouth. If you scream, well, don't. And if someone powerful says something incorrect, like the earth is flat, or women have too much free time, you nod. Not because you agree, but because surviving is more important than correcting astronomy. Even compliments must be handled carefully. Too humble, and you're fake. Too proud, and you're arrogant. Best to just say, thank you, look down, and hope no one asks follow-up questions. And yet, despite all this, you are still expected to be charming, to hold conversation, to sing softly when needed, to say the right thing at funerals, and the even more correct thing at baptisms. Your silence must speak volumes, and your words must never echo too loud. You are not voiceless. You are edited. And if one day you slip, say the wrong thing to the wrong person in the wrong tone, there may not be a second chance, just whispers, distance. And maybe a quick trip to the edge of the village where no one asks why you're packing. So speak carefully, smile gently, and whatever you do, never finish a sentence with certainty. Cleanliness is godliness. At least, that's what they say. And in your case, it better be true, because you're out of soap, again. There's no bathhouse, no perfumed oils, no lavender-scented anything, just cold water, a wooden bucket, and whatever scrubby rag hasn't frozen stiff overnight. You wash when you can, where you can, usually in a corner, behind a sheet, with half the family pretending not to look. Soap, if you have it, is homemade. It smells like ashes and boiled disappointment. If not, you make do with sand, or leftover bran, or just shame. You scrub your face until it burns, not to feel clean, but to not feel judged. Because in this world, smelling bad isn't just unpleasant, it's immoral. Dirt on your hem? Lazy. Sweat on your back? Unladylike. Grease in your hair? Spiritually troubling. Your body must be neat, your nails trimmed, your breath acceptable. Not because you have time or resources, but because appearances are tied to virtue. If you look tired, they'll say you're slipping. If you smell of smoke, they'll say you've given up. If you forget to comb your hair, they'll ask if you've stopped praying. Even your clothing, ragged though it may be, must be clean, or at least aired out, because people don't care if you're poor, they care if you look poor improperly. You keep a cloth tucked in your apron, not just for chores, but to wipe your hands before greeting someone holier than you. You rinse your mouth before church. You dust your shoes, even when they're falling apart, not because God minds the mud, but because people do. And don't forget your hair. It must be pinned, tied, hidden, always. Loose hair is for temptresses, witches, or worse, French women. You braid it by candlelight with fingers cracked from cold, whispering a prayer with each twist, hoping that today, at least, it stays in place. But the real cleansing isn't physical. It's spiritual. You confess every impure thought, every moment of jealousy, every ungrateful sigh, because sin doesn't wait for Sunday, it festers in your mind like mold in damp straw. And if you don't scrub it clean, they say, it will eat you alive. So you purify yourself with silence, with stillness, with the quiet, constant pressure to never be too much, too loud, too bold, too real. You wash, you rinse, you smile, even when your skin itches from cold, even when your spirit is heavier than your laundry basket, because being clean isn't about being comfortable, it's about being acceptable. Books are not for you. You're a woman. Your hands are meant for dough, not ink. Your eyes for stitching, not reading. Your brain? Best used for remembering recipes, saints' feast days, and when to keep your mouth shut. Education belongs to men, to monks, to the sons of merchants and minor nobles. You, on the other hand, might recognize a few letters, maybe enough to spell your name, if you're lucky and sneaky. But anything beyond that? That's vanity, or worse, rebellion. And yet, you're expected to raise children. Good children, obedient children, God-fearing, hard-working, quiet children, the kind that bow to elders, bless their meals, and don't ask too many questions. But how do you teach what you were never taught? You teach them how to kneel, how to curtsy, how to not embarrass the family. You teach them to pray in Latin, even if you don't understand the words yourself. You memorize them by rhythm, like a song you can hum but not translate. You show your daughters how to scrub a floor properly, how to pour tea without sloshing, how to survive a household without drawing attention. You teach your sons to keep their boots clean and their tempers quiet, because loud boys grow into dangerous men, and that danger will never touch them, but always touch someone like you. You don't talk about dreams, you don't mention curiosity. Those are luxuries, and luxuries, like books, don't belong in your kitchen. If your children ask about the stars, you say they were placed by God. If they ask why some people have more food, you say it's His plan. If they ask why the priest says women are weak, you say nothing and hope they forget. And if your child grows clever, starts asking too many questions, you get scared. Because smart girls are trouble. They draw attention. They speak when they shouldn't. They read. And reading, in a world like this, is the first step to being burned. So you teach your children how to survive, how to be small, how to be invisible and still useful, how to accept their place with grace and their pain with silence. And if they grow up bitter or broken or just confused, people won't blame your lack of schooling. They'll blame your lack of discipline, because ignorance in a woman is expected. But failure? That's personal. Looking good isn't optional. It's expected. Because even when your body is falling apart, your appearance must stay intact. Not for vanity, but for virtue. Your face must be calm. Your hair, tucked, pinned, braided. Your posture, straight. Your sleeves, clean. Your shoes, worn, but not filthy. It doesn't matter if you haven't slept in 3 nights, or if you're still bleeding from your 5th childbirth in 6 years. You must look composed, feminine, holy. Dark circles? Unacceptable. Loose strands of hair? Disrespectful. Wrinkled apron? Evidence of sloth. Pain is invisible here. You press powder made from crushed shells onto your cheeks to hide the grey. You bite your lip to stay pink. You pinch your own face before church just to seem alive. There's no makeup bag, just tricks passed from one woman to the next in whispered hallway lessons. A bit of ash for the brows, a smear of berry for colour, a touch of desperation, hidden behind a smile. You wear your best dress on holy days, even if you're still leaking blood beneath it. You tie the laces tightly to hide your slouch. You hold your breath for half the service to keep from fainting. Because beauty isn't luxury, it's duty. If you're too pale, they'll ask if you've sinned. If you're too flushed, they'll ask who you've been talking to. If you look tired, they'll say you're failing your household. If you look too good, they'll say you're failing your humility. It's a trap, a quiet, starched, lace-trimmed trap. And heaven forbid someone sees you cry. Your face must not wrinkle, your chin must not tremble. Even grief must be beautiful. You iron your scarf with a hot stone. You press your skirts with your knees. You brush your hair 100 times with a wooden comb until it gleams, because dull hair suggests poor morals. No one tells you why. And while you're doing this, the baby cries. The soup boils over. The fire needs tending. You bleed through another cloth. And still, someone calls your name from outside, and you must answer with your company face. A soft smile. A quiet nod. A lie told with posture and perfume. Because in this world, a woman who looks exhausted is pitied, but a woman who looks ugly? She's judged. And if you dare to ask why this matters, why beauty must survive, where rest cannot, someone will say, because it's what women do. No one says, because it's what keeps men comfortable. But you know, you always know, there is no safe room. Not your kitchen, not your bed, not even your church pew. You fear your husband, not because he's cruel, though he might be, but because he can be. He owns the home, the money, the land, you. His word is law, and the law is written by men just like him. He doesn't need a reason to be angry. You forgot the salt. You looked too long at the neighbour. You laughed too loud. His bad day becomes your punishment. And when the bruises fade, the silence remains, heavier than the slap. But you fear his mother more, because she's watching, always. She knows how a proper wife should behave. She knows when you kneaded the bread too soft, when you sat down too soon, when your voice was too sharp at supper. Her eyes are small knives. Her compliments are warnings. Her approval is currency, and you're usually broke. She remembers every mistake, and she keeps a list. For God, probably, or just for fun. You can't escape her, because you live under her roof. Even when she moves slowly, she moves first. Even when she says nothing, she says everything. You try to win her over with quiet hands and quicker apologies. You lose. Every time. And then there's the priest. He smiles gently, but you still tremble. Because behind every sermon is a warning. Behind every blessing is a reminder you are a sinner. A woman, born flawed, born to obey, born to suffer. You confess sins you're not sure you committed. You apologize for thoughts you didn't ask to have. You kneel until your knees go numb, trying to prove you're worthy of being forgiven for simply existing the way you do. You're told to love your husband, to honor your mother-in-law, to obey the church, to accept God's plan, which looks suspiciously like everyone else's control. You want to scream, but screaming is madness. You want to run, but running is scandal. So you fold laundry with reverence, and you stir stew like salvation depends on it. Because it kind of does. You tell yourself fear is respect, that obedience is peace, that this is just the way things are. But deep down, you know, you're not worshipping God. You're worshipping survival. And every bow, every silence, every carefully chosen word is a prayer not to be punished. You're bleeding. Again. Maybe it's your cycle. Maybe it's childbirth aftermath. Maybe it's an infection that no one will name and everyone will ignore. Doesn't matter. It's Sunday, and you have to go to church. There's no discussion, no exceptions. No, I don't feel well, or I just delivered a baby on the kitchen floor yesterday. Pain doesn't cancel prayer. Blood doesn't cancel God. You dress. You walk. You kneel. Slowly, carefully, silently. Your legs shake. Your linen cloth is soaked. But if you don't show up, people talk. She must be lazy. She must be hiding something. She must be drifting from God. So you smear colour onto your cheeks to mask the paleness. You wrap your shawl tighter to hide the tremble. You clutch your child with one hand and your dignity with the other. And you go. The church is cold. The benches are harder than the week you just survived. You sit with your back straight, your head bowed, and your insides aching. The priest is talking about sin. Again, lust. Vanity. Women. Always women. You try to focus, but your vision blurs. You wonder if anyone notices the sweat on your brow, the bite marks on your lip from holding in a groan. If they do, they don't ask. That would be impolite. You're not there to be comforted. You're there to be corrected. Every hymn, every verse, every warning feels aimed directly at your ribs. Your suffering is not special. It's expected, and the proper response is gratitude. Even now, as your body protests in waves, you are told to be thankful for your role, your cross, your blood, especially the blood, because nothing says holy like a woman in pain who never complains. Communion arrives. You shuffle forward, smile faintly, receive, chew, swallow, pray not to faint. After the final blessing, you don't linger. You can't. Your legs will only carry you so far before giving up. On the way out, someone compliments your composure. You always look so calm. You nod, because screaming would be unladylike. You return home not to rest, but to cook lunch. God may have forgiven your sins, but the soup won't make itself. And as you wash your hands, red water circling down a wooden bowl, you tell yourself you're strong, you made it through. But really, you just survived another performance. Because in this world, you're not allowed to bleed in private. You're smart. That's the first problem. You notice things early, patterns, cycles, weather shifts, the way animals behave before a storm, the way herbs help when someone coughs. You didn't call it knowledge. You just listened, watched, remembered, and that's exactly how they find you. Because in this world, a woman who knows too much is suspicious. A woman who knows more than a man is dangerous. A woman who knows anything that can't be explained by scripture. She must be a witch. You read once, a scrap of parchment tucked behind the priest's bench, a word or two you pieced together from watching your brother learn. When someone found out, you were told to pray it away. Books are not for you. Neither is logic, or healing, or opinion. You help your neighbor's fever with boiled leaves and a whispered prayer? Witchcraft. You predict a storm because the air smells wrong? Witchcraft. You own a black cat? Witchcraft with whiskers. Never mind the fact that you spend your days bleeding, cooking, and obeying. If your soup is too good or your garden grows too fast, someone will wonder if you've been talking to the devil. If your husband dies and you don't collapse weeping, they'll say you poisoned him. If you do collapse, they'll say you bewitched him with guilt. There is no winning here. You keep your head down. You pretend not to know things you absolutely do. When someone asks for help with a wound, you say, "I'll pray for you," even though you know exactly what plant could fix it. You dumb yourself down like it's armor. You smile when they mispronounce things. You laugh softly when they joke that women have soft brains. You nod when they say the plague is punishment for sin, not bad sanitation, because arguing is more dangerous than disease. And then there are the trials. Not in court, oh no, in whispers, in rumors, in glances exchanged at wells and marketplaces. You don't get a lawyer, you get a rumor, a torch, and a rope. You've seen women burned. You've smelled the smoke. The screams linger longer than the scent. Their crime? A dream, a dried herb, a stillbirth. So you hide your cleverness like a secret lover. You play dumb, not because you are, but because survival depends on it. Because in this world, being too loud can get you punished. But being too smart? That gets you burned. She's born screaming. Tiny, red, furious at the cold. And already, the world begins its quiet work of folding her into shape. You look at her and feel everything at once. Love, fear, guilt. Because you know what comes next. You know what girlhood means here. It means training for a life no one chooses. You wrap her tightly, not just for warmth, but for silence. Good babies don't cry. Good girls don't question. That's the first lesson. You teach her to sit with her knees together, to speak softly, to smile even when she doesn't mean it. You teach her that cleanliness isn't about health, it's about worth. That too much laughter draws attention. That too much thinking causes trouble. You do this gently, lovingly, regretfully. Because the truth is, you're preparing her for a world that doesn't want her to be whole, it wants her to be acceptable. You show her how to scrub clothes until her knuckles ache, how to kneel at church without wincing, how to eat last, speak least, and never ever correct a man. And when she asks, "Why can't I learn to read like the boys?" you hesitate. You want to say, "Because the world is afraid of women who understand it." But instead you say, "Because that's just how it is." You don't want to lie, but the truth is a luxury you've never been able to afford. You teach her how to braid her hair, how to hem a skirt, how to carry shame like it's part of her spine. You whisper to her that pain is temporary, even when you know it isn't. You pray she marries kind. You know she might not. You watch her grow. Awkward limbs, curious mind, a spark in her eyes that reminds you of yourself before the weight set in. You try to dim it just enough. Not to extinguish her, but to protect her from the flames. Because you've seen what happens to girls who shine too brightly. They are called wild, disrespectful, dangerous. They are punished, controlled, disappeared. So you teach her to survive. And she learns, fast. She learns to hold her tongue, to lower her gaze, to nod, even when it hurts. And when the time comes, she will walk into a marriage she didn't choose, smile through a labor she didn't want, and teach her daughter the same things you taught her. Not because she's cruel, but because she loves her too much to give her hope. Because in this world, hope is dangerous. But obedience? That's tradition. You've done everything right. You cooked. You cleaned. You bore children, buried some. You bled, knelt, prayed. You kept your voice soft and your hair neat. You endured, quietly. And now, you're dying. Not dramatically, not with poetry or purpose, just slowly, as bones loosen, breath shortens, and the days begin to blur. There's no ceremony, no farewell, no legacy. Just another woman slipping through the cracks of history. Your name isn't written down anywhere. You never signed a paper. You never held a book. You never had a portrait. No one carved your story in stone. Your face will fade from memory long before your grave disappears beneath the weeds. And still, some part of you hopes that someone will remember, that someone will say, "She was here," not because you were noble or brilliant or famous, but because you mattered, because you existed. You whisper final words, but no one listens. The house is busy. The fire needs stoking. The baby is crying. Life continues, as it always does, without pause for the dying. You think of the girl you used to be, the one who once dreamed, once laughed too loud, once asked too many questions. You wonder if she'd be proud or heartbroken. You don't ask for much, just that your daughter remembers your face, just that your name is spoken once more after you're gone, not as a burden, but as a blessing. But you know how it works. The men are remembered in war, the lords in land, the priests in scripture, the women in silence. Unless you die loudly, unless your death causes scandal, tragedy, a ghost story, unless your final breath comes with thunder and rumor, otherwise it's just over. They will say, "She passed in her sleep." They will say, "She was good." And then they will say nothing at all. So maybe, if you're lucky, someone will plant a flower near the spot, or name a recipe after your stew, or sing a lullaby you once hummed by accident. And if not, then let your life, your labor, your quiet pain echo in the bones of the next girl who dares to question, dares to hope, dares to remember. Because even if no one carves your name in stone, you were here, and you deserve to be. So now you've seen it. The list, the life, the loop. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy, just the daily reality of a woman in the medieval world. She wasn't a queen, not a warrior, not a saint in stained glass. She was the one who woke first, bled most, worked hardest, and vanished quietest. Her strength wasn't loud, her pain wasn't recorded. But without her, the castles wouldn't stand, the fields wouldn't grow, and the men wouldn't eat. She gave birth. She didn't die, most days, and then she did it all again. Not because she chose to, but because there was no other choice. And still, she laughed sometimes, sang quietly, held her children like hope, because even in a world that tried to erase her, she left something behind. A song, a stitch, a name whispered through generations. So tonight, as you rest in warmth, safety, and softness, remember her, not to pity, but to thank. She survived so you could choose not to. I wasn't born a goddess, or a saint, or even someone important. No temple bells rang the day I arrived. No scroll was written in my name. I was just a little Roman girl, wide-eyed, loud-voiced, probably more interested in chasing chickens than praying to Vesta. But one day, that changed. I was 7 when the men in white togas came to our house. They didn't ask me if I wanted to serve the gods. They told me I was chosen. A great honor, they said. A blessing for my family. A gift from Rome. From that moment, my childhood ended. They led me away through the stone streets, past market stalls and marble columns, into the heart of the city, into a temple, into silence. Inside the house of Vesta, I was stripped of my name, my toys, and eventually, myself. For 30 years I was to remain untouched by love, by desire, by the world. In exchange, I was granted privileges no other Roman woman could dream of. The power to free a prisoner, the right to own land, the respect of emperors. But don't let the titles fool you. My world was not gilded. It was locked. I was watched as if I carried the fate of Rome in my hands because I did, or at least, that's what they told us. While other girls laughed, loved, gave birth, grew old, I tended a flame, day and night, rain or shine, a fire that must never die, or else Rome would fall. You probably imagine us, the Vestal virgins, as serene priestesses in white, floating through temples like ghosts of perfection. But we weren't ghosts. We were girls, then women, then memories. And if you listen closely, I'll tell you what it was really like, to be honored, imprisoned, worshipped, and forgotten. To live 30 years inside a sacred cage, where even breathing too loudly felt like a sin. This is not a story about gods. This is a story about what happens when a little girl is told she belongs to them. They said the flame of Vesta must never die, not for a minute, not even in sleep. If it did, the city would fall, the gods would turn their backs, and the people would blame us, the 6 silent girls in white, living in the heart of Rome, as though we were something more than human. But fire, you see, is stubborn. It doesn't care about duty or prayer. It needs breath, wood, time, and a part of you too, something raw and alive. At first, I treated the flame like a chore. I was just a child. My arms barely reached around the bundles of olive wood. My hands blistered. I nodded off during midnight shifts and got smacked with the flat end of a priest's staff. I cried once. Just once. Never again. Later, I began to understand. The fire wasn't just real. It was Rome. People would bow as they passed our chambers. Soldiers crossed their chests. Women whispered wishes into the air. They believed the flame heard. They believed we heard. But behind those marble columns, we were always tired, always cold, or hot, or hungry, or holding in too many questions we weren't allowed to ask. We weren't allowed to touch anyone, to be touched, to be seen laughing too loud or walking too fast. Too much of anything was suspicious. Too much joy, too much anger, too much hair showing under the veil. So we learned to shrink, quietly, beautifully, and somehow, the more invisible we became, the more sacred they called us. Keeping the fire alive was easier than keeping my thoughts quiet. There were days I imagined running, out of the temple, down the streets, barefoot, shouting, "I'm just a girl. I want to be kissed. I want to scream and dance and cry and be messy." But I never ran, because I knew what happened to the ones who did. They told us stories of the fallen, Vestals who broke their vows, or were accused of it, sometimes falsely. You didn't need proof, just suspicion. If the priests found you guilty, they didn't whip you or burn you. That would stain the city with blood. No, they gave you a loaf of bread, a lamp, and lowered you into a sealed chamber underground, alive. They said it was cleaner, merciful. They buried you like a memory Rome didn't want. Every girl in white knew that fear. You could see it in our eyes when we lit the torches together. That flicker behind the ritual, the tiny, sacred panic. So we smiled. We performed. We survived. But I won't lie to you. I became good at it. Too good. By my 10th year, I no longer missed my mother. By year 15, I could spot the tiniest flicker in the flame and know what wood it needed. By year 20, I knew how to stand still for hours, how to answer questions without saying anything real, how to pretend the silence didn't ache. I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't free either. I was something else. Some days I'd catch my reflection in the polished bronze of the altar bowls. My face looked soft, distant, too perfect. Like a statue someone forgot to chip eyes into. I had forgotten how to want. And yet, the fire wanted. It always wanted. More wood, more breath, more of me. And so, I gave it. Not because I loved the gods, not because I believed Rome would burn if I failed, but because keeping the flame gave me something to hold, something that made sense in a life where I wasn't allowed to burn. They say devotion is holy, but sometimes it's just what's left when you've got nothing else to call your own. People worshipped us for our silence, our stillness. But the truth? The hardest part wasn't not touching. It was not being touched. Not just physically, spiritually, personally. No one asked what made me laugh or what I feared. No one called me by my real name again. They say fire purifies. Maybe. Or maybe it just consumes quietly, until there's nothing left but the illusion of light. I kept the flame, and in doing so, I learned to keep myself. Tightly, carefully, quietly, like a secret, like a myth, like a girl Rome wanted to worship, but never truly see. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Sacred flame, eternal duty, revered virgin priestess. That's what people imagine when they think of us. White robes flowing, serene faces turned toward heaven, hands gracefully tending a holy fire, like we were born to do it. What they don't see is the smoke, the sweat, the splinters, the blisters that split your palms when the wood's too dry and the logs too heavy. They don't see what happens when you forget to add wood. I did. Once. It was my third winter. I had the late shift, the coldest one. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes your fingers forget how to move. The kind where the silence of the temple feels like it's pressing down on you from all sides. I was tired. More tired than I'd ever been. I'd carried water that morning, scrubbed the marble floor, chanted prayers with the older girls, stood still through 2 ceremonies, and missed both meals. My body was 13. My spirit felt much older. I sat next to the flame, watching it dance, listening to it whisper. I told myself I'd close my eyes for just a moment, just to blink. When I opened them again, the fire was gone. Just a dull coil of smoke. Silent, ashen, still. My heart stopped. My breath caught. My stomach twisted so fast I nearly retched. I knew what this meant. Everyone did. The flame going out wasn't just an accident. It was an omen, a sign that the gods were turning away from Rome, and someone had to pay, and that someone was me. The next moments blurred. I remember running. I remember falling on the temple steps and scraping my knees. I remember stammering to the head priest. I don't remember crying, but I must have. They didn't scream. That was almost worse. They made me kneel in the atrium while they deliberated, not in private, in front of the other girls, in front of the gods, in front of myself. Then came the punishment. Not death, thank the gods, but close enough for a child. I was stripped of my white veil for 10 days, forbidden to speak, forbidden to sleep in the sacred chambers. I was taken outside the temple walls each night, to sleep on stone, under open sky, as if I had let the sky into the sanctuary and sullied it, and I was whipped, not hard enough to bleed, just enough to remember. They called it correction, I called it shame. But here's the thing, the punishment wasn't the worst part, it was the silence afterward, the way the other Vestals avoided my gaze, the way no one said my name, the way I felt seen, and not in the divine sense, seen as failure, seen as weakness. In those 10 days, I aged 10 years. I learned to never trust tiredness, never trust kindness from priests, and never, ever trust fire. Fire may look gentle, but it's waiting to betray you. It takes and takes and takes, and if you don't feed it, it turns to smoke and makes you the villain. I never forgot again. After that, I kept logs stacked in neat rows by the hearth. I counted them like prayers. I timed the burn in my head. I learned to listen for the moment the flames began to soften, that subtle sigh it gives right before fading. I became a master of the fire, because I had no other choice. People outside the temple still called us glorious. They threw flowers when we passed. They sang hymns to our virtue. But glory is a strange thing. From a distance, it glows. Up close, it burns. And for us, it burned slow. I think sometimes about other girls my age, what they were doing while I was being whipped in sacred silence. Maybe they were falling in love, laughing over wine, running through olive fields. Or maybe they were struggling too, but on their own terms. I didn't get to choose my struggle. Mine was assigned, labelled holy, painted gold, and wrapped in smoke. So yes, it sounds glorious. Until you forget to add wood, until the flame dies, until the city gasps, until your skin carries the memory of rope and reprimand. I've never made that mistake again, but I still dream of that smoke, the way it curled upward, like a spirit being released. Like freedom, like failure, like something I wasn't allowed to chase, because in Rome, even dreams had to be disciplined. People looked at me like I was a goddess. I wasn't. I was a girl in a white veil who hadn't seen her family in 15 years, who couldn't sneeze in public without a priest raising an eyebrow. But oh, they thought I was powerful. The Vestal virgins, they whispered. They can pardon a man from death with just a word. They walk through the forum, and even the magistrates step aside. All of that was true, but here's the part they never said out loud. We had power, yes, but we were never allowed to actually use it. Not freely, not without permission. Not unless it served someone else. I remember the first time I was asked to grant clemency to a prisoner. He was young, terrified, shaking in chains so heavy they dragged behind him like a second body. I stepped forward, lifted my hand, as tradition demanded, and declared him spared. The crowd gasped. His family wept. The guards released him. I should have felt proud, righteous, divine. Instead, I felt hollow, because I hadn't chosen to save him. I'd been told to. A senator's nephew. Political inconvenience. They needed me to play the holy card to clean up the optics. So I did. People say we had freedom, but the kind of freedom where you can only say, yes, that's not freedom. That's stagecraft. We could own property, yes. But what good is land you can't visit, or money you can't spend without a priest signing off? We could speak in public, but only about the gods, never about ourselves, never about what we felt. Felt was a dirty word in the temple. We weren't allowed to cry. Laughter was frowned upon. Dancing? Forget it. Love? Don't even whisper it. The power we had was ceremonial, controlled, conditional. We were symbols, walking myths, used to bless battles we didn't believe in, ceremonies we didn't understand, men we didn't trust. The strangest part? They feared us. Grown men, senators, generals feared the silence of 6 girls in white, because somewhere deep down they knew real power lives in the quiet, in the watching, in the knowing, and we knew everything. We watched more than anyone, heard more than anyone. We knew who slept with whom, who bribed whom, who lied and who got away with it. But we said nothing, because silence was our second vow. They taught us to hold our tongues like blades, sharp, but sheathed, always. There were times I wanted to speak. Oh gods, how I wanted to speak, about the corruption, the cruelty, the loneliness, the fear. But I didn't, not because I was brave, because I was smart. You speak, you disappear. That was the rule. Not officially, of course. The temple didn't stain itself with open punishment. But you'd be moved, assigned to a different chamber, cut off, forgotten. So we smiled, we bowed, we kept the fire. Once a younger girl asked me if I ever thought of leaving. Not running away, no one was that foolish. But leaving, emotionally, mentally. I told her, I left years ago. I just didn't move my body. That's the real power I learned in the temple. Not divine blessings, not ceremonial pardons, endurance. The power to remain. We learned how to bend without breaking, how to be still without going numb, how to obey without losing the little corners of self we kept hidden behind our eyes. That's not the kind of power people write songs about, but it's the only kind I truly owned. Do you know what else they gave us? Guards. Yes, we were protected. From whom? From everyone. From the world. From men. From life. From ourselves. 2 guards stood at our temple gate, day and night. They called it honor. I called it a cage with polished hinges. We were free to roam the city, in theory, but not without escort, not without approval, and always under watch. People bowed as I passed, but they also stared, and whispered, and speculated, about what I might be like if I weren't holy, about who I might have been before the veil, about what I might do if I ever stopped pretending. The truth is, I don't remember. I don't remember what I would have become, but I do remember the weight of the gaze, not the kind that sees you, the kind that uses you. I carried it like a second skin, and the longer I wore it, the harder it was to remember what my real skin felt like underneath. So yes, they called us powerful, and we were, in all the ways that didn't matter. And all the ways that did, we were ghosts, living ones, with just enough voice to bless a sacrifice, and not quite enough to save ourselves. I don't know if you've ever gone 30 years without doing anything wrong. Not just no crimes, I mean no rumors, no whispers, no bad hair days, no wrong tone, no wrong blink, no wrong smile to the wrong person. That was the job. We weren't just meant to be pure. We were meant to be unblemished, constant, eternal, beyond suspicion, like statues that breathe. And statues don't get crushes. Statues don't roll their eyes. Statues don't miss their mothers or have awkward thoughts at midnight. I wasn't allowed to be a person. I had to be a symbol. It was exhausting, not just because of the rules, though there were plenty, but because I was always watched. Always. Guards, priests, other vestals, foreign dignitaries, curious children, superstitious wives, lecherous senators pretending to be pious. Everyone watched the Vestal virgins. And if you were a Vestal, you learned early, you're not allowed to look back, only forward. Gracefully, quietly. Do you know what it feels like to be stared at constantly but never seen? It's like being broadcast to the whole city, every hour of every day, except no one is allowed to ask if you're okay. There were days I felt like I lived in a performance art piece I hadn't agreed to be in. You know how some people say, just be yourself? That phrase meant nothing to us. I didn't even know who myself was. I knew the role, glide, nod, serve. I knew the lines, prayer, blessing, silence. But the girl behind the white robe, she had been swallowed whole. And in her place stood something holy, polished, palatable. You didn't just keep your vows. You had to look like you enjoyed it. One raised eyebrow from a senator could cause weeks of whispering. One misplaced laugh could trigger an inquiry. One too long glance at a soldier. God's help you. We all walked with our heads high and our eyes trained perfectly still. Not out of pride, but because blinking wrong might mean someone would wonder what else you were hiding. They called it a life of honor. I called it a life on live stream, centuries before live streams existed. It's strange. We weren't allowed to be in love, but the city was obsessed with the idea of us falling in love. They told stories about Vestals seduced by generals, or caught sneaking out at midnight. They whispered the names of men we had barely spoken to, twisting silence into scandal. And yet, in 30 years, I never once touched a man, never once kissed anyone, never even let myself imagine it for too long, because I knew what it cost. A single suspicion, not even proof, and you could go from sacred to buried alive. Literally, we all knew the stories. A girl smiles too brightly at a gladiator. Suddenly, she's stripped of her robes and sealed beneath the earth, with a loaf of bread and a lamp. That was how Rome punished its untouchable women, without touching them. I sometimes wondered what was worse, dying because of a lie, or living without ever daring to test the truth. So I stayed good, 30 years of it. No scandal, no lover, no one whispering my name for the wrong reason. Just the fire, just the silence, just the endless echo of footsteps across marble halls. I started counting tiles, watching shadows, timing candle drips just to keep myself from screaming. There's a kind of madness that comes not from chaos, but from stillness. From being so perfect for so long that you start to wonder if you're real. Sometimes, I'd press my hand against my chest, just to make sure I still had a heartbeat, because no one ever asked. They asked if the fire was strong, if the prayers were said, if the sacrifices were pure. But me, I was never the question, only the tool, only the answer. And when my 30 years finally ended, when the high priest told me I was free, I didn't even know where to go. Who was I? Without the watching, without the robe, without the script? I had done it. 30 years of perfect silence, 30 years of being a symbol, 30 years of not making a single mistake. But let me ask you something. Is a life without scandal still a life? Is lovelessness a virtue, or a prison without bars? And who was I, now that Rome had stopped watching? There were moments, fleeting, quiet, impossible to admit, when I allowed myself to imagine a different life. A breath of air outside the temple, a kiss stolen in a dark corridor, a hand, not divine, just warm. They came like daydreams, quick, soft, treacherous. And every time they did, I remembered the pit. They never let us forget it. The place beneath the city where they buried the ones who dared too much or were simply accused of it. They didn't call it a pit, of course. That was too crude, too honest. They called it the Chamber of Shadows, a space beneath the earth, hollowed out like a mouth that never screamed. It was where reckless Vestals went to die. They were given a single lamp, a loaf of bread, water, some say a few coins, as if Charon himself would pity a girl crushed under the weight of duty and doubt. They weren't executed, not officially. That would have tainted the sanctity of our vows. They were entombed, sacrificed to the gods, they said, in solemn silence. We all knew what it meant, buried alive. No blood spilled, no public outcry, just a quiet vanishing. And because it was done in the name of purity, the city blessed it. Once, when I was 16, I asked an older Vestal, barely above a whisper, if anyone had ever been proven guilty. She looked at me like I was a child still, which of course I was. She said, "It's not about guilt, it's about danger, and doubt is dangerous." From that day forward, I trained my thoughts like I trained the fire. Careful, steady, never too wild. I became a fortress of self-control, because to slip, even in imagination, meant inviting the grave. And you didn't have to sin, you just had to seem capable of it. A glance, a laugh. A man's name spoken one too many times. One of the girls, Livia, disappeared when I was 22. We were close as we were allowed to be. She liked to hum when she swept. Her laughter was bright and sudden, like cracked sunlight on marble, too alive for the halls we walked. Then one day, she was gone. No explanation, no farewell, just a strange silence from the high priest that made everyone lower their eyes. Later, I heard whispers that she'd spoken too often to a stable boy, that she'd smiled too warmly, that someone had seen them alone. That's all it took. Even the possibility of broken vows was enough to bring the pit back into play. And once that doubt settled over you, like soot in the folds of your robe, there was no brushing it off. Rome couldn't risk scandal, so it removed the risk. Livia was swallowed by the shadows, and we all kept sweeping. After that, I stopped humming. Even my dreams began to censor themselves. If I imagined a man's face, it blurred before I could name him. If I dreamed of running, I'd wake, with my hands clenched so tight my fingers ached for hours. The pit didn't need to be seen to be real. It lived in our heads, under our feet, behind every rule. It was the ghost that walked beside us in daylight and climbed into our beds at night. And what haunted me most wasn't the idea of death. It was the way the world kept turning after it happened. Rome didn't mourn, it applauded. Because a bad vestal removed was a civic wound cleaned. Better to sacrifice one symbol than let the whole illusion crack. So we lived with a different kind of fear, not of violence, but of erasure, not pain, but disappearance, not judgment, but forgetting. And so, I became quieter, more careful. I smiled less. I spoke only when spoken to. I watched every word like it was a match near dry straw, because the pit had no walls. It was in the glances of priests, in the silence of the other girls, in the way no one said Livia's name again. It was in me, and maybe, if I'm being honest, it still is. Even now, long after my robes were folded and laid away, even now, when I walk freely and sleep in a bed without guards outside, I still hesitate before I laugh. I still flinch when someone looks at me too long. I still check the corners of rooms, as if doubt might be hiding there, waiting. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the stone lid. I hear the scrape. I feel the weight of a lamp in my hands. Not because I lived it, but because I lived so close to it. For so long, it carved itself into me. So yes, I kept the fire. I kept my vows. But not because I was holy, because I was afraid. Afraid of a silence deeper than anything I'd ever known. A silence that no prayer could lift. A silence that began with stone and ended 6 feet down. People ask me that sometimes. Not out loud, of course, but I see it in their eyes when they hear what I was. When they say the word vestal with that mix of awe and discomfort, like I'm some holy relic left behind by accident, and I can almost hear the question hiding underneath. Do you regret it? Do I regret giving 30 years of my life to the flame? To the silence? To a city that watched me constantly and never truly saw me? The honest answer? Yes and no, and everything in between. There were days I hated it. Hated the veil, the rules, the way my voice shrank until it barely belonged to me. I hated waking up in the middle of the night to check if the fire was still breathing, even after my shift had ended. I hated the way my body forgot how to want, how to rest, how to be. There were moments, many, if I'm being truthful, where I imagined running, not physically, just mentally slipping out of the room, out of the robe, out of the life. But there were also moments when I felt powerful, quietly, deeply powerful, like when I walked through the forum and even senators stepped aside, or when I raised my hand and a condemned man was spared, or when I saw fear in the eyes of the ones who ruled, because they knew I knew more than I ever said. And there were nights the fire whispered something only I seemed to hear, nights when the temple was still, and the moon poured in, and for a few fragile seconds, I felt at peace. Not because I was worshipped, but because I had become so still, so exact, so invisible, that the noise of the world couldn't touch me. Do I regret never falling in love? Yes. Number sometimes. The truth is, I don't even know what that word means anymore. I never had the chance to find out. Love was always something that happened to other people. Behind courtyards, beyond whispers, beyond reach. I had friendships, of course. Quiet ones. Shared glances. A laugh too loud once, quickly smothered. I remember one of the older girls, Junior. She used to squeeze my hand at night when I couldn't sleep. That little squeeze felt like rebellion. We never said it, but I think we both needed something to hold. So no, I don't regret everything. I learned things inside that temple you don't learn anywhere else. How to endure, how to hold your ground while the world pushes, how to breathe without being seen, how to carry pain like jewelry, polished, hidden in plain sight. And when I finally left, robe folded, vow released, I stepped outside those marble gates with a kind of clarity that only comes from long, disciplined silence. But the world had changed, or maybe I had. I didn't know how to laugh loud, how to flirt, how to answer simple questions like, "What do you like?" or "What do you want?" For a while, I lived like I was still being watched. Even in freedom, I kept my eyes low, my voice soft, my sleeves long. The hardest part wasn't starting over. It was realizing I'd never had a beginning. So do I regret it? Sometimes I think I do, when I see a mother holding her child, or lovers brushing hands under a fig tree. When I hear a girl sing off-key in the street, and know I never dared to be that free. When I remember how I used to measure every word like it could kill me. But sometimes, I think no, because I survived, because I learned the shape of power, and silence, and danger, because I can look back now, and tell this story, and say, this was real. I was there. I bore the weight of Rome in the crook of my back, and I did not bend. That counts for something, doesn't it? Not all regrets burn. Some just glow, quiet, constant, like the coals of a long-dead fire. You don't tend them anymore, but still, they're warm. And sometimes, when the world feels cold, you sit beside them and remember what it meant to keep something alive, even if that something was never truly you. It was late, the kind of late when even the city held its breath. No cartwheels on stone, no drunks in the alleys, no owls in the cypress, just stillness, thick and absolute. I just finished my turn tending the flame. Kneel, adjust, whisper, feed the fire, routine, practice to perfection, no thought needed. My body did it on its own, like muscle memory carved over decades. Then I turned out the oil lamp by the altar, a small, familiar gesture. I'd done it 1,000 times, but this time, the darkness didn't fall softly. It landed on my skin, my shoulders, my ribs, heavy. And that's when it happened. That tiny, uninvited thought, the kind that doesn't knock, just slips in and sits beside you. You're a prisoner. I didn't want to believe it. Not after all those years of being called sacred, honored, untouchable. But there, in the dark, with nothing but the crackle of fire behind me, I felt it. Not sadness, not anger, just recognition. This wasn't freedom. It never had been. It was a golden cage, with silk cushions and marble walls and incense, so thick it choked the questions before they formed. They never beat us. They never starved us. They never dragged us in chains. But they didn't need to. Because when you teach someone to police their own thoughts, their own breaths, their own heartbeat, the chains become invisible, and so much more effective. I sat there, cross-legged on the cool floor, staring at nothing, and for the first time in my life, I asked myself a question I had never dared before. Who decided this was holy? Who decided that silence was sacred? That a woman untouched was somehow more valuable than one who had lived, loved, cried, stumbled? Who decided that tending a fire for 30 years without flaw made me divine, but wanting anything beyond it made me dangerous? And why did we agree? The answers didn't come, not that night. But the questions stayed. They followed me like smoke in my clothes, clinging in places I couldn't reach. And once you start seeing the bars, you can't unsee them. That same week, I walked past a mirror-polished urn in the atrium. I caught my reflection. My face looked calm, devout, unmoved. But my eyes, My eyes looked trapped. It was subtle, the kind of trapped you only notice after years of pretending you're not. And I realized something else, something that cut even deeper. No one ever asked if I wanted this. Not when I was chosen, not when I took my vows, not when I was praised or punished or paraded through the streets. I was an offering, a symbol, a chess piece dressed in white. And people don't ask chess pieces if they like the game. They move them, they admire them, they sacrifice them when the board demands it. That night, in the dim glow of the eternal flame, I stopped seeing myself as the blessed and started seeing myself as the used by priests who needed purity to prove the gods still cared, used by senators who wanted Rome to look moral while doing anything but, used by a city that praised obedience and feared real power. We were called powerful, yes, but only so long as we didn't use it, only so long as we stayed beautiful and quiet and untouched, only so long as we stayed containable. I rose from the floor slowly, my joints stiff from sitting too long. I stretched. I turned toward the flame, and for a second, just a second, I imagined blowing it out, not as rebellion, not as destruction, but as release, the kind that says, "You don't own me anymore." Of course, I didn't do it. I lit another log. I bowed. I walked away, because that's what I had been trained to do, but the thought stayed. And from that night on, every time I lit the fire, I wondered, was I preserving Rome, or was I just feeding my own cell? I never told anyone, not even the other girls. We were loyal to each other, yes, but trust had its limits, because in a world where doubt was deadly, even friendship had rules. Still, I carried the knowing with me, tucked deep in the folds of my robe, hidden in my smile, etched behind the practiced blink of my eyes. I did my duty. I stayed devout. But I was no longer theirs entirely. That night, in the quiet, I had cracked open, and the fire inside me, the one they hadn't trained, had begun to burn. When you hear about a Roman Vestal Virgin, you probably picture something sacred, a white-robed figure moving through marble halls, untouched by time or sin, eyes lowered, hands folded, eternal flame flickering behind her. And maybe, in a way, that's true, but it's not the whole truth. We were symbols, yes, but we were also girls, then women, then, mostly, silence. You hear Vestal and think purity, but do you think of loneliness? Of self-censorship so complete that your own breath feels like something borrowed? Do you think of 30 winters passed without a hand on your shoulder? Of waking every day wondering if today's smile will be the one that gets misread? You hear honor, but do you think of the cost? They said we were chosen, but I didn't choose. None of us did. We were watched, measured, praised for our restraint, forgotten for our humanity, and yet we kept the fire. Not because we believed Rome would crumble without it, but because that was the only thing that was ever ours. The flame didn't lie to us. It didn't flatter. It didn't punish. It just asked, "Will you show up again tonight? Will you feed me? Will you stay?" And so I did. For 30 years, I showed up. I fed the fire. I held the silence. I wore the robe. I became the statue they needed. But now, when I hear the word Vestal, I think of something else. I think of the weight of light. I think of the sound of breath in empty stone corridors. I think of women who gave Rome their youth, their warmth, their voices, and asked for nothing but not to be erased. So, if you remember us, don't just remember the white robe. Remember the girl beneath it, the one who laughed softly at night but never out loud, the one who pressed her fingers to her chest to make sure she was still alive, the one who burned quietly, long before history set her name in stone. I kept the fire, but I was never just its keeper. I was fuel. And when the last ember fades, and the temple stands cold and empty, perhaps then, finally, someone will ask the question no one ever dared to: who kept me? On a smoky evening in Victorian London, long before smartphones and satellite dishes, I found myself hunched over a wooden crate that smelled like dust, spices, and something older than time. It wasn't my first crate, but it was the first time I knew exactly what was inside. A mummy, wrapped tight in linen, shipped halfway across the world, and now lying in a warehouse lit by flickering gas lamps. Somewhere upstairs, someone in a top hat was preparing brandy, and inviting guests to an unwrapping party. And me? I was the man who helped dig it out of the desert. They didn't call us thieves, not out loud. Officially, we were laborers, assistants, porters. Unofficially, we were the people who knew how to find the graves the archaeologists didn't write about. The shallow ones, the forgotten ones, the ones that hadn't been catalogued but could still be sold. I didn't wear a whip or a fedora. I wore a sun-scorched shirt and a scarf over my face, and I spent most days crawling through sand and tombs that smelled like old leather and bitter almonds. We told ourselves it was history. We were preserving it, rescuing it, giving it a second life in glass cases and museum halls. But when you've carried 15 crates in 1 week, each one containing a human who once had a name, you start to wonder. The Victorians had a taste for the exotic. They filled their parlours with crocodile skulls, scarabs, and papyrus scrolls. But mummies? Mummies were the crown jewel. To own one was to own a piece of eternity. To unwrap one in front of your guests, well, that was entertainment and science in one dramatic evening. But none of it starts with the unwrapping. It starts in the sand, in silence, in heat. In the narrow chamber of a forgotten tomb, where I stood with a lantern, staring at something that looked back through 3,000 years of time. And I asked myself, what the hell am I doing here? You'd be surprised how many people did. Back then, in London, if you were rich, respectable, and vaguely bored, it was practically a status symbol to have something dead. Preferably foreign, preferably ancient, and best of all, wrapped in linen and mystery. I once helped unload a crate at a manor house in Mayfair. It was snowing. I remember because the men who owned the place didn't bother to come outside. They sent a boy in a velvet vest with a silver tray. On it was a tip for me, 5 shillings and a note. Please set the mummy upright in the conservatory, just beside the ferns. I stood there, holding 3,000 years of embalmed royalty like it was a potted plant. The ferns, by the way, were imported from Ceylon. The mummy was from somewhere near Thebes. The owner? He sold railway parts. That was the absurdity of it all. Mummies weren't just for museums. They were for dinner parties, drawing rooms, and amateur scientific pursuits. The Victorians had convinced themselves that they were the inheritors of every ancient civilization. Rome, Greece, Egypt, they thought it all belonged to them now. And to own a mummy wasn't just morbid curiosity, it was possession of legacy, of power. Some men wanted mummies for science, others for spectacle. A few, believe it or not, wanted them for medicine. There was a thing called mumia, a powdered substance made by grinding up real mummies. It was sold as a cure-all, for headaches, for internal bleeding, for, well, just about anything. You could walk into a chemist in London, and if you asked the right man behind the counter, walk out with a bottle of what was essentially pharaoh dust. I've seen it, brown, dry, with a faint metallic smell, like old coins. Some claimed it came from the resin used in embalming. Others whispered it was the actual flesh, crushed and sifted fine. Either way, it sold. The idea of swallowing Egypt appealed to a certain kind of gentleman, the kind who collected fossils, kept a skull on his desk, and insisted on the health benefits of mercury. Then there were the unwrapping parties. I never got invited to one. Wrong class, wrong boots. But I knew men who attended, and I saw what was left afterward. They were held in parlours and lecture halls. Invitations were sent out like it was a gala. Candles flickered. Wine was poured. And then, with the solemnity of a priest and the flair of a stage magician, some retired colonel or gentleman scholar would slice through the ancient linen and peel it back, layer by layer. They called it education. They claimed it was for science. But if you listened closely, under the oohs and ahs, what you heard most was laughter. Look at the teeth! Smells like cloves. Is that a necklace? And then, inevitably, someone would crack a joke about curses. There's a kind of arrogance that comes with empire. It makes people believe that everything they touch is theirs by right, even the dead. But not everyone was trying to mock the past. Some were truly obsessed. They wanted to understand Egypt, to recreate it, to bring it home. They built rooms styled after tombs, read hieroglyphics by candlelight, and believed the secrets of the universe might be hidden behind the eyes of a mummified priestess. I once helped carry a mummy into a private cabinet of curiosities for a widowed baroness. Her late husband had been a diplomat in Cairo. She insisted the mummy was her friend. She lit incense whenever she entered the room. She spoke to it, sometimes. I don't know if that was madness, grief, or devotion, maybe all three. But for most, mummies were just exotic decorations, conversation pieces, proof that you had travelled, or at least had money enough to pretend you had. There was one man, Sir Henry something, I forget the full name. He ordered 3, one for his study, one for his country estate, and one he supposedly buried upright in the garden as a joke. The gardener refused to go near it after dark, said the eyes glowed. I didn't believe him, but I never went near it either. What struck me most was how quickly the mystery faded for them. These were bodies that had survived empires, sandstorms, looters, and time itself. And yet, once unwrapped and propped upright, they became just another bit of clutter between a zebra rug and a Greek bust. But for me, even after all those shipments, all those crates and quiet nights in the warehouse, the mystery never really faded. Every mummy felt different. Some looked angry, others looked serene. A few looked like they were still waiting for something. And sometimes, when I was alone and the lantern hissed low, I would whisper an apology under my breath. Not because I believed in curses, but because it felt wrong not to. So, who even wants a mummy? The short answer? Almost everyone, if the price is right. The long answer? Men who never set foot in the desert. Women who think loss can be cured with relics. Scientists, opportunists, collectors, and charlatans. And sometimes, people like me. People who didn't want one, exactly, but still found themselves standing in the dark, with sand on their boots and history in their hands, asking, how did we end up here? I didn't grow up wanting to dig up dead people. In fact, I don't think anyone ever does. There's no childhood dream that goes, one day, I'll crawl into a sand-choked tunnel, pull a 1,000-year-old jawbone from the dirt, and hope no one's watching. But life is funny like that. Sometimes you don't fall into a job. Sometimes the job falls on you, like a pile of crumbling stone and bone dust. It started with tea, or, more accurately, with crates of tea. I was a porter for a shipping company in Alexandria. My job was to help load and unload goods from the boats that came in from all over the Mediterranean. Spices from the Levant, rugs from Anatolia, dried fruit from God knows where, and of course, crates of tea bound for London. Tea was the new gold. People would kill for it. People did kill for it. And tucked in between the tea shipments occasionally, there'd be something else. Something heavier, wrapped tighter, marked with strange symbols or no markings at all. One day, a man with an English accent and a sunburn like parchment asked if I wanted extra coin to help move a special package. I was 23, underfed, and owed 2 weeks' rent. Of course, I said yes. The package was a coffin, not a wooden casket like you'd see in a churchyard. This one was long, tapered, covered in painted glyphs, and coated with a kind of ancient lacquer that smelled of honey and smoke. It had eyes, carved into the lid, big, almond-shaped eyes that stared right through you. I asked what was inside. He smiled and said, history. That night, I earned more than I usually made in 2 weeks. The next time he came through, I asked if he had more crates. He did, and soon, I wasn't just carrying them, I was helping him find them. He introduced me to a man named Karim, who knew every cave, pit, and crumbled shaft for miles around Luxor. Karim wasn't an archaeologist. He didn't care for timelines or dynasties. He cared about what the buyers wanted, and what they wanted was anything that looked old, gold, or funerary. Coffins were best. Mummies were better. A mummy with intact wrappings and amulets. That could feed your family for a year. I remember the first time I went into a tomb. It wasn't dramatic. No booby traps. No curses muttered from shadowed walls. Just silence. Thick and choking, like sand packed between your ribs. We lowered ourselves in with rope and lanterns. The shaft was narrow and steep, the air dry and full of dust so fine it turned our sweat into clay. Inside, it was surprisingly small. One chamber, painted walls, a broken vase in the corner, and a wooden coffin, cracked at the base. Karim didn't hesitate. He went to work like it was routine. I stood there, frozen. I wasn't looking at a box. I was looking at a person, a body, a story that had ended long before my grandfather was born, Kareem noticed. He clapped me on the back. "Don't think of them as dead," he said. "Think of them as valuable." I didn't believe him, but I also didn't stop. That's how it works. The first time, your hands shake. The second time, you sweat. The third time, you start noticing the details. Which tombs are undisturbed? Which ones were looted in the last century? Where the amulets usually go? How to pull apart brittle linen without tearing it? Which sarcophagi sound hollow when tapped? It became familiar. Not easy, never easy, but familiar. Sometimes we found fragments, shattered statues, broken masks, loose canopic jars. Sometimes we found nothing at all but sand and scorpions. And sometimes we struck gold. Once, we opened a tomb to find not one but 3 mummies, side by side, like they'd been tucked in by some ancient caretaker. I didn't ask who they were. I didn't want to know, because it was easier that way. Easier to believe I was a worker, not a thief. A mover, not a grave robber. I told myself stories. That if we hadn't taken them, someone else would have. That they were safer in Europe. That museums meant preservation. That I was helping history speak. But most of the time, history wasn't speaking. It was screaming, quietly, through every cracked tooth, every snapped femur, every amulet ripped from a rib cage, and I was learning how to ignore it. Some nights I couldn't sleep. I'd see faces in the linen folds, hear whispers in the wind off the dunes, smell incense where there was none. Other nights, I'd drink myself numb and convince myself I was a professional, an expert, someone who understood the past better than those who just studied it. Truth is, I was just getting better at looking away, but the money kept coming, and London kept asking for more. Mummies for collectors, mummies for doctors, mummies for museum basements that smelled of mildew and ambition. And so I kept digging, not because I liked it, not because I believed in it, but because when you've gone far enough down, it's hard to find the rope that pulls you back up. You'd think after the first dozen mummies nothing would surprise me. You'd be wrong. There's something about the past. It doesn't like being predictable. Just when you think you've figured out its patterns, it hands you something so bizarre, so utterly out of place, you have to stop and ask, why? Or sometimes, what the hell am I looking at? Like the time I unwrapped a mummy and found a cat tucked inside the chest cavity, not beside the body, not at its feet, inside, where the lungs should have been, perfectly mummified, wrapped in linen, with tiny golden beads threaded through the fabric, like someone meant for it to sparkle in the dark. There was no explanation, no inscription. Just a priestess, at least that's what the jewelry suggested, and a cat inside her ribs like a secret passenger on the way to the afterlife. Kareem said, maybe it was her favorite. I said, maybe it was a warning. Neither of us opened our mouths for the next hour. Then there was the head, just the head, not embalmed, not wrapped. Just sitting in a stone box like someone had decided halfway through the mummification process that the rest of the body wasn't worth the effort. Its eyes were closed, lips curled into the faintest smile. The teeth, still white, grinned up at me like it knew something I didn't. We found it in a tomb filled with children's toys. That was worse than the head. Once, in an otherwise empty tomb, I found a scroll tied with a silk ribbon. You have to understand, silk doesn't survive easily, not in that kind of climate. But this one had. And when we opened it, carefully, with gloves and tweezers and the kind of reverence reserved for sacred things, it turned out not to be a prayer or a poem, but a list. A shopping list. Grain, beer, goose, oil, 1 pair sandals, written in careful looping hieratic. Someone had taken the time to bury their grocery list for eternity. Either that, or it was a note sent with the dead, so they could restock on the other side. I honestly didn't know which version made more sense, but the strangest thing I ever touched wasn't ancient. It was recent. We had been contracted to clear out a tomb thought to be sealed for millennia. It wasn't. Someone had been there before us, maybe 5 years earlier, maybe 10. The inside was ransacked, chaotic. Fragments of a mummy scattered across the floor, wrappings shredded like parchment after a rainstorm. But in the far corner of the chamber, Half buried under a stone slab, I found something that didn't belong. A pocket watch. Silver. English make. Still ticking. It was scratched, dented, and the chain had snapped. But the faceplate was intact, and when I opened the back, there was an inscription. To RJ, may time be kind to you. A. We never found RJ. We never found the body. Just the watch, ticking faintly in the heat of the tomb, like time had gotten lost down there and never figured out how to climb back out. I kept that watch for a while. Didn't sell it. Didn't show it to anyone. Just kept it wrapped in a handkerchief in my coat pocket. Sometimes at night, when the desert winds howled through the tents, I'd take it out and listen to the tiny ticking sound. It didn't comfort me, but it kept me company. Then there was the finger. We weren't even looting that day, just clearing debris from a collapsed shaft so the academics could come in with their notebooks and measuring sticks. I reached into a pile of sand to lift a stone, and my hand closed around something soft, softer than it should have been. It was a finger. Mummified, yes, but oddly preserved. The nail still intact. A ring still on it, copper, with a small blue scarab inset. The scarab had a tiny crack down the middle, like a frozen scream. I never told anyone about the finger. I buried it, didn't catalogue it, didn't bag it, didn't tag it for shipment. I just dug a small hole near the edge of the dig site and pressed it into the earth. I told myself it was respect. Maybe it was guilt. Some things you just shouldn't carry with you. But it wasn't all death and decay. I touched gold once. A necklace, still hanging around the neck of a body that had been reduced to almost nothing but dust and bone. It shimmered under the lamplight like it had just been forged. The links were fine, smaller than a grain of rice, and threaded with carnelian beads and a single charm shaped like an eye. I held it up and for a moment I forgot where I was. That happens too. The past has this way of pulling you out of yourself. 1 second you're just a man in a pit, covered in sweat and dirt, and the next you're imagining a woman, alive, regal, proud, fastening that necklace before walking into her own tomb, knowing exactly what waited for her. It humbles you. Even now, after all this time, I can still feel the texture of some of those things. Linen so brittle it flakes at your touch, sand-polished wood, smooth alabaster bowls, teeth, always teeth. They last longer than they should. So yes, I've touched strange things. But the strangest of all, that's easy. It's the moment right before you touch something. When your hand hovers, your breath catches, and time thins out, you know you're reaching through centuries into a world not meant for you. And for that brief, impossible second, it feels like something's reaching back. People imagine smuggling like it's in the movies. Men in cloaks, slipping through alleyways, treasure hidden under floorboards, secret knocks on locked doors. But the truth? It was much more boring. And much more brilliant. The mummy black market didn't run on shadows. It ran on paperwork, on loopholes, on charm, on looking just official enough to avoid questions, but just vague enough to not leave a trail. Here's how it usually worked. A collector in London, or Paris, or Boston, would write to a dealer, not a shady man in an alley, a gentleman, with a mustache and a letterhead. He might own an antiquities consultancy, or a cultural preservation bureau. The titles were flexible. The money, less so. The dealer would then reach out to someone like Kareem, or sometimes to people like me, people who had access to tombs, people who could tell the difference between a dynastic priestess and a well-preserved farmer's wife. We'd get a list. Sometimes it was detailed. Female mummy, intact, 18th dynasty preferred. One complete coffin with painted lid, no visible cracks. Amulets at least 5, ideally with falcon or scarab motifs. Other times it was vague, something impressive for a museum gala, a specimen suitable for public lecture, anything with teeth. I wish I were joking. Once the order came through, we'd head into the desert, find what we could, patch it up as needed. Sometimes we even rewrapped mummies, stitched their linen, glued their charms back in place. Restoration, we called it. Marketing, really. Then came the tricky part, getting it out. Most people assume we hid them, buried them in false-bottom crates, smuggled them out under nightfall, but most of the time, we didn't have to. You'd be amazed what you can declare as textiles or dried organic materials if your handwriting is neat and your bribe is generous. At the port, we'd pack the mummies into crates labelled things like archaeological samples, botanical study material, library scrolls. And it worked. Customs officers weren't historians. They were tired men who wanted the paperwork to match and the job to end. You slipped a few coins under the manifest, nodded politely, and the crate was on its way across the sea. There were middlemen, of course, always are. One man I worked with wore a monocle and insisted on being called Professor, though no one ever saw him teach anything but how to bluff. He'd grease hands from Alexandria to Southampton, and by the time the crate reached the British Museum or a private estate, it came with a full backstory. The mummy of a high priest of Karnak, recovered with care by respected locals under the guidance of British scholars. Never mind that we found it half-crushed under a collapsed wall with a goat chewing its foot. Provenance was everything, and if it didn't exist, we invented it. We even had templates for the labels, and no one asked too many questions. The market wasn't just collectors and museums. Doctors bought mummies for anatomical study. Theatres bought them for stage props. I once heard of a playwright who had one standing in the wings for authentic atmosphere. He named it Rupert, gave it a costume. Even painters wanted them. Something about the colours of dried flesh and antique linen. Some claimed the crushed remains of mummies were perfect for making mummy brown, a pigment so warm and rich that artists painted masterpieces with it. And yes, it was literally made from ground-up people. But the most consistent clients? Universities. They wanted specimens, bodies to unwrap, educational tools. Every good lecture needed a moment of shock. Nothing beats unrolling a 1,000-year-old corpse in front of a stunned audience. They called it education. We called it product delivery. And still, beneath all the paperwork and polishing, there was this strange duality. On the one hand, they revered Egypt. They called it the cradle of civilization, quoted Herodotus, wrote poems about the Nile. On the other hand, they treated its dead like souvenirs, shipped, shelved, and shown off. There was one crate I'll never forget. It was marked garden statues, fragile. Inside was a mummy seated upright, its hands crossed, its face so serene it almost made you forget it had been dug up like a lost umbrella. Someone had placed a rose in its lap. I don't know who. Maybe one of the porters. Maybe someone felt guilty. That crate went to a townhouse in Chelsea. A week later, I heard the owner hosted a dinner party where the mummy sat at the head of the table while the guests laughed and poured wine. I've never been able to decide which was worse, the laughter or the silence that came after. The black market wasn't hidden. That's what made it so effective. It thrived in daylight, in polished rooms, in polite conversation. It was colonialism in linen, neatly boxed and labelled. We weren't smugglers. We were suppliers. And London, Cairo, Marseille, and New York, they were always buying. I never got invited. I wasn't the sort they let in through the front door, not with my boots still carrying desert dust and my palms still smelling of resin and linen. I was the man who brought the mummy in through the back, the one who made sure it stood upright, didn't fall apart, and looked just exotic enough to impress the guests. But I saw them, from the corners, through half-open servant doors. Sometimes, I stayed behind a bit longer than I should have, pretending to check the crate, wiping non-existent dust off a coffin lid, just to watch. Because you don't forget the sound of 100 people laughing at a dead body. The unwrapping parties, they called them. A Victorian obsession, equal parts science, theatre, and absurdity, somewhere between a public dissection and a parlour game. You'd receive an invitation, usually handwritten, sealed in wax, ornate as a wedding announcement. You are cordially invited to witness the ceremonial unwrapping of a genuine Egyptian mummy, recently procured from the Theban necropolis. Wine and light refreshments to follow. Guests would arrive in full evening dress, the women in lace gloves, the men in cravats, pearls and curiosity strung around every neck. The room always smelled like perfume, candle wax, and anticipation. In the centre, under gaslight or chandelier, stood the guest of honour, wrapped in linen, propped upright on a velvet-covered platform, sometimes with incense burning nearby. Occasionally, someone would place flowers at its feet. I never knew if that was irony or guilt. Then came the expert, always a man, always in gloves, sometimes a museum curator, other times a retired officer who once served near Cairo and fancied himself an Egyptologist. He'd clear his throat, raise his voice, and begin with a little speech. Ladies and gentlemen, before you stands a relic of the ancient world, a bridge between past and present. What you are about to witness is not merely spectacle, it is science. And then he'd take the knife, always small, always precise, and the room would go quiet. Layer by layer, the linen came off, sometimes stiff with resin, sometimes fragile as dried leaves. It would flake in the air, settle on gowns and waistcoats like ash. A few people would cough politely. No one left. With each layer came a new discovery, an amulet, a beetle charm, a painted prayer, a glimpse of skin, dried and dark as smoked oak. Murmurs filled the room. Someone would gasp. Someone else would sip their wine like this was opera. I once saw a woman faint when the face appeared, not because it was gruesome, because it was human. That was always the twist. For all the ritual and drama, the corpse wasn't monstrous. It wasn't skeletal. It looked like a person. A quiet face, eyes closed, lips slightly parted as if still mid-prayer. But that didn't stop the jokes. Rather dashing, isn't he? My dear, he has your nose. At least he's better preserved than my husband. And the laughter would ripple through the room like it had every right to be there. I remember one unwrapping where the mummy turned out to be a child. Small frame, narrow limbs. A pendant shaped like a bird, still nestled against its chest. No one laughed that night. They didn't cry, either. They just drank more. The host ordered the pianoforte played a little louder. The body was quietly wheeled away before dessert. No one mentioned it again. What disturbed me wasn't the unwrapping itself. It was the ease of it. How quickly awe turned to amusement. How reverence gave way to routine. How the dead became performance. Some truly believed it was scientific. They made sketches, took notes, spoke of advancing our understanding of ancient burial customs, but others were just there to say they'd seen it, to collect the story, to tell friends over tea. Yes, last night we unwrapped a priestess. She had real gold in her teeth. One man even tried to buy just the head afterward, said he wanted it for his library. I didn't stay long after that. The worst part? These weren't bad people. Not cruel, not malicious. Most were soft-handed academics, society ladies with too many brooches, curious gentlemen with too much time. They believed they were engaging with history. They believed they were honoring the past. But belief doesn't make it true. Sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I'd find the discarded linen in the bins behind the house, piled like laundry. Strips of history that had clung to a body for 3,000 years, now tossed beside shrimp shells and cigar ash. And I'd wonder, did anyone ever imagine, when they were wrapped for burial beneath the stars of Thebes, that they'd one day be unwrapped in a dining room in Kensington while people nibbled on canapes? We never found curses carved into tomb walls, but I sometimes think the real curse was this: to be remembered, but not respected, to become entertainment, to become a moment in someone else's evening. They say history repeats itself, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just lingers, in the form of linen flakes on silk gloves, and laughter echoing in a room that never asked permission to open the dead. And me? I learned to leave before the last layer came off, because once the face was revealed, I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't tell myself it was just science, just work, just another delivery. It was a person, always had been, always would be, even when no one in the room seemed to notice. It didn't come all at once. There was no thunderclap moment, no ghostly voice from a sarcophagus, no hieroglyph glowing with warning, just a slow shift, a quiet unraveling of something inside me. At first, I thought it was fatigue, too many nights in the sand, too many crates, too many linen-wrapped figures staring at me through time. But it wasn't exhaustion, it was recognition. The first real crack in the armor came in the form of a child. We'd found the tomb unexpectedly, off a dry gully in the Valley of the Nobles. Kareem thought it had been looted, but once we slipped inside, it was clear. It hadn't been touched. The air was still, heavy, as if it hadn't moved in thousands of years. The walls were painted with scenes, figures holding hands, birds in flight, lotus blossoms blooming under sun gods, joyful things, soft things. Not the grandeur of pharaohs or the solemn march of priests, but something simpler, human. And there, in the center, was a coffin barely 4 feet long. We knew what that meant. The wood was cracked but painted lovingly. Someone had carved a tiny sun disk above the face. When we opened it, we didn't find treasure. No gold, no amulets. Just a small body wrapped carefully, as if someone had folded every corner of the afterlife into that linen. The child's hands were crossed neatly. There was a toy lion tucked beneath one arm. A bead necklace around the neck, strung with small blue stones. I didn't touch it. Kareem reached in to examine the linen. I stood back. Something about it felt wrong. Not just the act of disturbing it, but the thought of where it would go. I could already picture it. Weeks later, in a smoky drawing room somewhere in London. A party. Laughter. Isn't it, darling? So small. Like a doll. I told Kareem we should leave it. He didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. He just looked at me like I'd asked the desert to stop being hot. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the tent, staring at the canvas roof, watching shadows move like drifting linen above me. I kept thinking about the toy lion, about whoever placed it there. A mother? A sister? A father with dust still on his knees from digging the grave? They had loved that child enough to bury them with their favourite thing, and I was ready to sell it for £50 and a customs form. After that, I noticed everything more sharply. I noticed the hesitation in my hands, the way my breath caught whenever I pried open a coffin lid, the way my eyes lingered a little too long on the faces we uncovered, faces I once saw as artifacts, now impossible not to see as people. I began to remember details, little ones, a mole on a cheek, a chipped front tooth, braids still clinging to a skull, human quirks that survived centuries, not relics, remains. And the guilt didn't come like a wave. It came like a slow tide, rising, filling the cracks, seeping into places I hadn't even known were hollow. I began to see the work differently. The crates I packed weren't cargo. They were coffins, again. The ports weren't transit points. They were funerals with paperwork. I wasn't preserving history. I was exhuming it for entertainment. It wasn't just what we did. It was why we did it. Not for reverence, not for knowledge, but for demand. We didn't dig because the world needed answers. We dug because someone needed another centerpiece. Another mummy to unwrap between champagne toasts and canapes. I remember one job in particular, a rush shipment. A collector in Edinburgh wanted something dramatic for a New Year's gathering. He likes them tall, the dealer said, with the gold still on the chest if possible. We found a candidate, well preserved, painted mask, intact bandages, beautiful, in a way I can't describe, like stillness made flesh. I wrapped him slowly, carefully. And halfway through I stopped, not because of a relic or damage, but because I realized I was whispering an apology under my breath. I didn't even know I was doing it. I just found myself saying, I'm sorry, over and over, as if I could wrap a corpse in guilt and make it holy again. I never told anyone. Not Kareem, not the dealers, certainly not the buyers. To them, it was still just business. But to me, the veil had lifted. The magic was gone, and all that remained was a bitter clarity. We weren't archaeologists. We weren't even thieves. We were trespassers, on memories, on rituals, on grief. You can study a culture. You can learn its language, its gods, its geometry, and song. But to dig up its dead for display, that's not study, that's spectacle. And somewhere between the first crate and the last breath of that child's tomb, I'd crossed a line I didn't know was there, until I was too far past it to go back. That's when I started packing slower, moving quieter, touching less. That's when I stopped opening the crates after they were sealed. That's when I knew I hadn't just been disturbing the dead. I'd been burying pieces of myself right alongside them. It didn't end with a bang. It never does. There were no headlines, no sweeping laws, no sudden reckoning. The era of mummy hunting, of crates and candles and laughter over corpses, didn't collapse overnight. It dried out, slowly, like linen left too long in the sun. One day, the orders stopped coming as fast. Another day, the dealers stopped replying to letters. Some vanished altogether, moved on to other trades, or retired with their riches, or died in rooms lined with cabinets full of dust and bones they couldn't quite bring themselves to part with. The appetite for mummies dulled, not because of morality, not because someone woke up and realized the dead should rest, but because fashion changed. What once passed for scholarship now felt a little grotesque. Society shifted. The novelty wore thin. Egypt was no longer an exotic playground for the British imagination. It had become familiar, museumified, labelled and locked behind glass. And there was the war. Not one war, really. Many. Colonial skirmishes, revolts, murmurings of nationalism. Egypt wanted its past back, or at least wanted it to stop being shipped out like souvenirs. The government began tightening controls. Permits became harder to forge. Customs officers began asking better questions. It became riskier. One of the last shipments I ever handled was stopped at the docks. Not confiscated, just delayed. A young official, barely 20, asked me what was in the crate. I gave him the usual answer. Botanical textiles. He didn't believe me, but he didn't challenge me either. He just looked tired. That's when I knew it was over. Not because I'd been caught, but because even he was weary of it. The whole system had become a kind of slow-motion embarrassment, like a parlour trick no one laughed at anymore. Collectors moved on to other things. Skulls from the Pacific, fetishes from the Congo, artifacts from the Far East. Wherever the empire pushed next, the market followed. The mummy trade didn't die. It migrated into footnotes, basements, and auctions no one talked about in polite company. And I stayed behind. Not in Egypt, exactly, but in that strange limbo between the past and the people who couldn't let it go. I worked smaller jobs, legal digs, warehouse cataloguing. No more tombs, no more knives, no more linen. But I carried the silence with me, the kind of silence you only find underground, the kind that sticks to your skin long after the crates are gone. Sometimes I'd walk past the museums, the ones we shipped to. I'd stare up at the grand facades, at the stone lions and Latin inscriptions, and wonder, were they proud of what they held inside? Or had they simply forgotten where it came from? And sometimes I'd go inside. Not often. Just when I felt brave. I'd wander the halls, hands in my pockets, keeping my head down. And I'd look, not at the big sarcophagi or golden death masks, but at the corners, the cases near the back, the ones with faded labels and cracked glass, the ones no one really visited anymore. That's where the crates ended up. There's a kind of peace there, a quiet the living rarely earn. I found myself apologizing again, whispering it under my breath, like a prayer I no longer believed in. I'm sorry. You didn't ask for this. You deserved better. I never knew their names, but I remembered their weight, how they felt in my hands, how they never got lighter. I thought, for a while, that history had forgotten us all, that our little moment of greed and spectacle would be buried like the very things we stole. But it lingers. You see it in the news, when countries ask for repatriation, when museums debate what ownership means, when descendants speak up and say, that body isn't your artifact, that's my ancestor. And they're right. The era ended, but its consequences didn't. You can still walk into a gallery and find someone who wasn't supposed to be there, not as a curiosity, not as a teaching tool, not as decor, just a human, wrapped in linen, waiting to be laid to rest. The world moved on. The empire faded. The sand reclaimed the sites. The tombs grew silent again. But every now and then, a crate shows up in some attic, or a dusty museum room gets reopened, or someone finds an amulet for sale online, misidentified as vintage jewelry. And I remember, it never really stopped. It just stopped looking like what it was. The end didn't roar. It whispered, through the hinges of wooden lids, through linen unraveling in soft yellow light, through the half-finished notes of collectors who didn't quite know what they had, or why they needed it so badly. The last time I touched a mummy, I didn't pack it. I didn't carry it. I didn't unwrap it. I just stood there and nodded, not out of reverence, not out of fear, but out of something simpler, something quieter, recognition of a life once lived, of an era once ended, and of a silence I had helped create. I slow down, not just to read the plaques, not just to admire the carvings or marvel at the gold. I slow down because I know what's missing, not the artifacts, the rest of the story, The digging, the dust, the silence. Every glass case holds more than an object. It holds absence, of names, of rituals, of choices that weren't made by the people on display. Someone somewhere decided this body, this mask, this bead was better off in London or Boston or Berlin than in the earth where it was laid to rest. And for a long time, that someone was me. I walk past the mummies now, and I don't look at their faces first. I look at their hands. Most are folded across the chest, fingers long turned to leather, still resting in the same pose placed by someone thousands of years ago. A mother, maybe, a priest, a friend, someone who never imagined their gesture would end up behind glass, under cold museum lights, silently watched by strangers in comfortable shoes. I wonder what they would have said had they known. I don't linger. I nod. Sometimes I whisper a name that feels right, even if I don't know it. Peace to you, or just, you're not forgotten. The truth is, museums make it easy to forget the human part, the neat lighting, the careful curation, the language, specimen, artifact, object. But these were people. They lived. They feared. They prayed. They loved. And they died, expecting to stay buried. And now they're surrounded by phones and footfall and filtered light. Some days, I want to scream, not in anger, in shame. Other days, I just walk slower, eyes down, remembering the weight of linen in my hands. You won't find my name on any exhibit. I never made history. I just moved it, quietly, carefully, and sometimes regretfully. They call it a legacy now. Colonial collections, empire-era acquisitions. A sanitized way of saying we took what wasn't ours and put it behind glass. But legacies cut both ways. Every time a visitor stares too long, every time a child asks a question, every time a museum decides to return what never should have been removed, something shifts. Maybe that's redemption. Maybe it's just the world catching up. But for me, it's enough to walk slowly, to keep my hands in my pockets, to offer silence instead of spectacle, and to remember that some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be left alone.